So you wanted to look at knitting in the round, didn't you?
Yes, now with knitting the round, it covers a lot of things. It's anywhere where we're making a tube of knitting rather than a flat piece. So it could be a sock like I'm working on here. You can see it just goes round at the top. It could be a hat, it could be a sweater. It has the advantage of, if you're making anything like a hat or a sweater, of not having to sew up, that you have a tube that is the body of your sweater, or your hat has no seam in it. Now there are a couple of ways that you can knit in the round, and we're going to show you two of them today. One of them is using double pointed needles and one is using a circular needle. So we're starting with double pointed needles. Now I usually use 4 needles, you could use 5. The technique is exactly the same. So I start by casting on all my stitches onto one of my needles. I've got 38 and I want 42, so I'm just going to pop the other 4 on. I use cable cast on, but it doesn't matter what sort. You just use whatever cast on is comfortable for you and is going to work for your project. So now I've got my 42 stitches and I want to divide them. If I'm using 4 needles, I want stitches to be on 3 needles when I start off.
So the 4th one is the knitting needle.
That's right. So I've got 42, which means I need 14 on each needle. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 12.
But this is where
14.
it gets a bit fiddly, isn't it?
It is. Well, it looks more fiddly than it is. You've just got this little bit. You've got to take a little bit of patience with it. 3,
How do you make sure the needles don't drop out?
They just don't. I'll demonstrate there. That is, everybody thinks the needles are going to fall out, but there's just enough grip on your needles and with your yarn, they just stay in one place. So to make sure they aren't tangled, I pop them down on a table and I arrange them so that my needles are in a triangle. And what I want is my little ridge of cast on stitches. I want it to be on the inside of my triangle all the way around. And then you can see all your stitches are going the same way.
I see that, yeah. So, but now then when you pick it up, when I've done that before.
So now you pick it up very carefully. And we slide these 2. So the other thing, apart from getting twisted, is people worry about is a gap at the start. So what I do, and again this works for any cast on, is I take my last cast on stitch, which is in my right hand, and I slip it onto the left needle. Then I lift my first cast on stitch over the top and onto my right needle. So I've crossed those over. Now I'm going to set that down again for a minute because I want to make sure I always know where that start of the round is.
Why is that important?
Well, if you're doing, say, your sock pattern says do 14 rounds in rib, you don't want to end up halfway around your sock and suddenly change into stocking stitch. You want it to be all the way around, neatly around your tube. So if you know where you started, you know when you finished a whole circuit of your stitches.
And is that a lockable stitch marker?
That's a lockable stitch marker. So I'm literally putting it over my stitches in between my first and last stitch, because that way it won't drop off as I work round. So I've still got my triangle. My cast on stitch ridges are still pointing to the inside.
Happy days.
So what I do now is simply, and this is the bit that everybody says looks like wrestling hedgehogs, is I just find my first stitch and I start my rib. And in a moment I'm going to swap to show you one that I've done some work on so you can get a better idea of how to handle the stitches, because it does look very odd when you're starting off.
So you're doing a 1-on-1 rib.
I'm just doing a 1-on-1 rib along this first needle. But I think this is a good time.
The first row is always the hardest, isn't it?
It is. So it's a good time, so it's easier for you to see how this works, for me to swap to one where I've done a few rows. So here I've got a cuff where I've done, this is actually 2x2 rib, where I've done a few rounds now, so it'll be easier to see how you knit with the DPNs. You'll see as I've worked, I've moved my lockable stitch marker up so that it's close to where I'm working the whole time, so I can't possibly ignore it. So when you're doing DPNs, I think the problem that everybody has is they start thinking about all 3 needles at once. But actually what I want you to do is forget about the 2 needles that you're not working with at the moment. So I'm only working on the stitches on this needle.
That makes sense.
That's the only needle I'm worried about. So I'm just going to start my 2x2 rib, and I just let the other two needles hang down. They make a bit of noise. These ones are quite clicky, but you get used to that.
Now you're coming to the end of the needle. What happens now?
Yeah, so I've just got 4 more stitches to do now. So we'll do these last 2. So this needle comes out. I still have my stitches on 3 needles. So all I do is I rotate to the next needle. The needle that I've just finished with goes to my right hand, and I just start again.
So just one needle at a time?
Yeah, so just think about the next needle you have to knit across. So now we're looking at the circular needle. As you can see, we've got a needle on this end and a needle on this end, and they are joined by a wire or a cable. So this means you can go round and round in a circle. I always think of it as 2 knitting needles joined, a bit like those children's mitts with a string. Now to join, we're going to do it just like we did before. We're just working on a circular needle now. So again, I'm making sure that my cast on is facing in the same direction all the way around. And again, I'm going to move my last cast on stitch onto my left needle, and I'm going to lift my first cast on stitch over the top and on.
That's so cool.
Then I'm going to get this lovely little stitch marker here. I've got a little birdie. And I'm going to pop that so it dangles down on my needle. And this will tell me where the beginning of my round is. When you're working on circular needles, the best sort of stitch marker is one you can hang from them, because every time you come round, you're just going to hit that and you just want to slip it to the other needle again, but it'll always remind you where you are. And then just to tighten up my join even a little more, I'm going to get my tail and my working yarn, and I'm going to knit my first stitch with both of them.
Oh, that's a handy tip.
So that again helps just pull everything together. And then just drop your tail and keep knitting. I'm just going to do some 2x2 rib.
And you just keep going round.
And you just keep going round.
So this kind of seems, if people are scared of DPNs, this seems like a good solution.
This is really handy because you just keep going round and round until you get the length you want.
But what if the project they're working on is socks? Can they use a circular needle then?
Yes. So for this project, I've got the actual number of stitches would take up more space to the length of my cable, but that wouldn't be the case with socks. So I've got some socks, a sock type project to show you. So if you want to do a small project like a pair of socks or some gloves, and you've got to work on a circular needle, you could get a very small circular needle that you could just go round and round on. But if you want to just use an ordinary one, you use a method that's called magic loop. So what we've done here to do our magic loop is we've divided our stitches exactly in half. And what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to pull the cable from the back, because I want to
But not all the way through.
Not all the way through, because I want to work on these front stitches. So I've got a bit that I can move with now. I want to hold the 2 bits together just so that I don't get a big strained gap here. And I put my needle into my first stitch. And all I want to do now is I just want to knit.
So it's just that first stitch you need to be careful of.
You just need to be a bit careful. You don't want to leave a big gap and strain your stitches there. And then we just knit across. And we get to the end and we turn around. Just get ourselves some more yarn there. So now I want to pull this one through so the stitches are on the front.
Oh, okay, yes.
Yep. So now those are the stitches I've just worked.
Yes.
So I can pull the needle through them. Put a little bit of loop on the back.
Oh, look
I don't
at
need
that.
a big one. And then I can hold them together again. And then I'm ready to start knitting along these front ones again. And every time you get to the end of the ones that are on one needle, you just turn it round and pull through like that. And you can keep going till your sock or whatever you're making is the right length.
Does it always have to be half and half of the stitches?
When you're doing something small like this, that works best. You could try varying it by 1 or 2 stitches every few rows.
Just in case you're worried about the gap?
Yes, in case you're worried about stretching it. But you really want to keep it fairly even for this method. But I'm going to show you another method where you've got a few more stitches that you can use for bigger projects. So if you've got a bigger project, you don't need to do that conventional magic loop in the same way. With this hat, if you imagine if I was trying to divide the stitches in 2 each time, I get quite fed up. What I do instead is I do a variation. So I just pop my right hand needle, just a few stitches on it, and I pull my cable through a piece. So you can see there I've just got a few stitches on. Then I find somewhere in the middle of my hat.
Doesn't matter where.
No, wherever is comfortable for you. And I just grab a loop. It's so easy to grab the loops. You think, oh, that I'll not be able to grab the cable, but it just pulls through. And you push those stitches up so that you've got a group of stitches on your left hand needle.
So it's making a smaller diameter then, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And the rest of the stitches just stay on the cable.
Okay.
You don't need to worry about them. And so we just knit, sticky hands. So we just knit across what we've got on that needle. And then you'll find already these stitches are slipping down the needle, so they're already rearranging themselves as you work. If you get too many, you can just slide it along a bit.
So it's just arbitrary how many stitches and where
Yes,
you pull the cable
wherever
through,
you're
just wherever
comfortable.
suits, yeah.
And the thing about that is because you're not pulling it through in the same place all the time, you're very unlikely to get one of those little strained ladders you might get.
Right.
And the other thing you'll notice is I'm just knitting and knitting here. And when you're working in the round, if you just keep going in the knit stitch, you get stocking stitch because you're never turning round.
I love that.
You only need to do purl when you want garter stitch.
That works really well when you're knitting Fair Isle because using the knit stitch in Fair Isle is easier than the purl
Yes.
with your float size and everything.
So that's much easier. So there you go. So I've now got to here. And I'm just going to do the same thing again. I'm just going to slide some stitches off my right needle and make a loop. And then I'm just going to come down to just past my stitch marker, I think this time. And I'm just going to grab that and make a loop there. If you've got nice circular needles, they'll slide in and out so easily. There's no fuss to this. And then I'm ready to go again.